pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic
for
which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty,
and
justice
for all.
Chris, you want to call the roll? Or you want me to?
You can, Jay. And
Okay, I'm here. Dave Carden,
I'm here.
Jim
Carden's here.
Spears,
Present.
Patricia Hilton,
present.
Renee Jones,
Present.
Michael Burk,
Here.
Amanda Souza. No Amanda Souza. Michael Marcello. Present. Jennifer Siciliano.
Present.
And we have a new member, which we'll talk about after we talk to Scott Millar, and that's Bill Vierra.
Mr. Chairman, before we start, I'd just like to remind us that we have yet to choose a secretary. So since it's not on the agenda, I will take the minutes again. But
It's not on the agenda.
but next week, can we put that on the agenda? But I will take the
Yes,
minutes tonight.
I
we have
will.
some.
Actually, I'll make a note of it. Not treasurer, secretary. Okay, so the big purpose of this meeting is that arguably this is our third attempt at a solar ordinance for Tiverton. The first was the ordinance of March 12, 2018, which was repealed in November of that same year. The second was a draft ordinance that was started in November of 2019 and dragged on until October 21st, largely because COVID hit us and it sort of got forgot, I guess. Scott Millar, who is with us tonight, gave us critical comment about that draft solar ordinance. Part of that was the planning board submitted its findings on October 5th of 21 and found, in its opinion, that there were numerous areas of inconsistency with the requirements of the comprehensive plan. And they reviewed that. They compared our ordinance to the comprehensive plan in its entirety and decided that there was a lot of inconsistencies. So without further ado, we have Scott Millar with us. He's one of the wheels at GrowSmart. He's helped a lot of other communities with the process we're going through here now. So without further ado, Scott, you're in the barrel.
Well, thank you so much. Just to introduce myself perhaps a little further, I'm the Director of Conservation and Community Assistance at GrowSmart. My involvement in this particular topic goes back at least 5 years. I was a member of the Office of Energy Resources Task Force for re-examining state programs for solar siting. I was also a member of a task force also set up by the Office of Energy Resources to develop guidance for solar siting for communities. I assisted several towns in drafting a solar siting ordinance, and I'm a local planning board member in the town of Exeter. So I have some firsthand experience with working with solar development, and it's challenging. As you know, prior to 2017, this issue didn't really exist. Most towns in Rhode Island didn't have a solar siting ordinance. They didn't know that they needed one. And we've sort of made this transition from towns adopting something, finding out quickly that it was inadequate, and scrambling to try to make changes while they were being, in some cases, inundated with solar applications. So it's been hard. The planning community and folks like Jennifer who are really good at what they do know how to manage other land uses. There's, generations of experience. There's a lot in the literature for creative techniques to manage residential, commercial, manufacturing, but solar was new. And frankly, a lot of local officials had never even seen one on the ground. So it was pretty challenging to craft an ordinance for something that was new and people didn't have a lot of experience with. And unfortunately, around the same time, the state wasn't providing much guidance to communities. They just sort of launched this new program and just assumed towns would handle it. Unlike most other state programs that provide incentives, the renewable energy siting programs don't have any selection criteria to determine where it might be best for the state to provide incentives for renewable energy. Therefore, basically everything is eligible for the funding. And unfortunately, as we've all found out, in more rural areas, in larger parcels of land, particularly forest and farms, are the ones that are most economically beneficial for solar developers to site solar. So there's been a lot of controversial projects on those locations, as you well know. And to be clear, Rhode Island needs, obviously we need renewable energy. So it's putting towns in a tough spot. You certainly don't want to say no. It's critical that Rhode Island makes the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy as quickly as possible. But on the other hand, you have a responsibility that to implement your community comprehensive plan. And I haven't reviewed your plan in great detail, but I'm assuming it has policies to protect your farms and your forests and your scenic vistas and your community character and the integrity of your residential neighborhoods. And so it's hard to cite utility scale solar in a way that would be consistent with those other goals and policies. So it's this real balancing act that Tiverton is long, and all the other 39 cities and towns are really struggling with. And as I indicated in my memo that I sent to Jennifer back in October, the areas that have the least conflict tend to be areas that have been already developed or disturbed, or they're already zoned for an intensive use, like commercial or industrial zone lands. In those types of areas, we tend to see the least amount of conflicts at the local level. Where we see the most conflicts is in residentially zoned areas, particularly on farms and forests. There's a very large project pending right now in Johnston that's going to be approximately 300 acres. And as you can imagine, that's becoming very controversial. There's no end in sight to this. Rhode Island clearly needs renewable energy. We need solar. And there's going to be a constant need to provide it. Your challenge is to find out where is it most appropriate in your town, and every town has to handle this differently. It's not a one size fits all strategy at all. And you just have to look at your comp plan. You know your town better than anyone. Where do you think this land use that is really a manufacturing use is, at least the utility scale solar has been deemed a manufacturing use? Where do you believe that's most appropriate in your town? And I could help you answer some questions. Again, I provided a lot of details in the memo. Hopefully you've all had a chance to take a look at that. But again, there's no simple solution here. I wish there was. happy to entertain questions. I'm not sure how you want to manage this.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask Mr. Millar a question?
Yes, you can, David.
Scott, I'm thinking just as a matter of process now in terms of how we might do our work, because we've got a fairly compressed time period in which to get something to the council. And there are many aspects of this and dimensions of this that are elusive, I'm sure, to at least they are to me. I'm sure they are to others on this call. As a process matter, if we were to come to some general or consensus amongst ourselves as to the siting that we want to incentivize, restrictions that we think, the broad scale restrictions that we want to try to adopt, let's just say for a moment, just for purposes of explaining what I mean, let's just say we say anything that's beyond a certain size has to be on a industrial site or whatever the case may be, but no deforestation beyond X number of trees, whatever we do. Is there some drafting help that we could get to put those broad conclusions into an ordinance or a form of an ordinance that where we wouldn't make inadvertent mistakes? So does Grossmart or do others or do you have the ability or the inclination to try to help with that kind of drafting process? Now, maybe I'm being presumptuous because there may be such expertise amongst us that we really don't need that. But I would be myself, and I'm not the principal draftsman by any means, but I'm not a draftsman at all. But the question is, how would we actualize the things we want to try to actualize in the detail that ultimately is going to be required, since there's not a lot of history with regard to this in the past and things that would be, templates for us. Does that question make sense?
It does. And as Jennifer knows, and what planners like myself have been doing for a long time, is we look to other towns that might have similar circumstances, and we see what they've done, and we try to modify it or customize it to meet the needs of Tiverton. Some town, like you might start with a town like Exeter. Gloucester, it has a pretty good approach. Then Little Compton has an approach, and again, those are all towns that have some similarities, certainly, to Tiverton. And then it gives you a better idea of how each one has approached it a little bit differently. And then you need to determine, what did they do? Well, are there elements of what they did that you like, but perhaps they're too stringent or not stringent enough? And then you begin to customize it. And unfortunately, there's no, it's hard to give folks a model and say, just sort of fill in the blanks. It's something I know at GrowSmart we'd like to do. We just haven't been able to find the resources to fund that because we think that would be very helpful. But again, you'd almost need one for a rural, a suburban, and more of an urban community because they're so different. So it's hard to craft something like that that would be good for all 39 cities and towns.
No, I take that point. I guess my concern, and I don't know if it's shared by others on the advisory committee, is others are struggling as well, as you've observed. Some have done it better than others, and we've got our hands a little bit on who may have done it a little bit better than others. But we don't want any inadvertent mistakes. We surely don't want to open ourselves up for litigation. We want the clarity that's required to avoid that catastrophe. And so, it's sort of, I guess it's as a matter of process. I'm just thinking there's quite a few of us here, and there obviously is more capacity than I probably have on this. But in terms of paragraph 1. Well, you realize that this may actually be unclear as to the following points, and you consider this. I mean, the kind of question and answer sort of thing that ultimately could get us to what we all, I think, want to try to accomplish, which is an ordinance that is first rate, not just simply, cobbling together somebody else's, best efforts, if you will, because we've gone to some real effort here to put together quite a team to try to do that. So, anyway, I don't want to take any more time, but that kind of process is concerning to me from the outset, because I think that it needs to be tight and comprehensive.
It does, and those are all good points. And I don't mean you just sort of copy and paste from other towns, but you look at other towns to get ideas. But I think the most important element is, first of all, getting a group such as you've already assembled to have the conversation about where in Tiverton do you think it's appropriate, and then you could, whoever is going to be crafting your ordinance needs to hear that from you. Are there other areas where you don't want it at all? And then there might be other areas where you think it's okay, but it's the size and the scale of the solar that you might want to limit. For example, you might have in an industrial area, and there you might not have many limits on the size. If you really want to have, if you have a good site in town, you might want to relax your solar land coverage to allow the maximum use of that particular area. And you know that developers would take advantage of that and basically build it out to whatever your setback and screening requirements might be. There might be other areas where you might want to entertain solar, but at a very small size. So you might establish a footprint and just of 40,000 square feet or less. And again, these sizes are just starting points. You can customize them. In a community like Exeter, where we have a lot of large parcels of land, we have different categories of solar that we allow. We have small, and these might be up to 15,000 square feet. So it's pretty small. Then we go from a little larger up to about 40,000 square feet. And then we just keep getting bigger, and our utility scale is something that's going to be having a footprint that's greater than 5 acres. Anything greater than 5 acres, we've determined, is large. That's where we want it in an industrial zone or an old landfill site or something like that. And we've drawn, we don't want that interspersed with our residentially zoned properties.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question?
Scott, I think you've been on the planning board in Exeter for a while, right?
I have.
Yeah, so you were there during just like when we stumbled initially. I know Exeter had some stumbles at the front end of it, because I'm good friends with Bob Johnson, who was on the council. And so what kind of lessons might you have from that experience to help us make sure that our next effort is not a stumble again?
Good question. We stumbled big time because we just didn't really fully grasp the first ordinance, and I wasn't on the planning board when that was developed. In a sense, we didn't even have an ordinance. We were just sort of allowing it. Our zoning inspector was finding a way to sort of allow these small scale projects to go forward. And people weren't that concerned about it because they were small. They had footprints of about 40,000 square feet. They were actually located in fairly appropriate locations. And there wasn't a lot of pushback. And then we started seeing very large applications coming in with footprints of 20 to 30 acres. And then we realized we just didn't have an ordinance that was going to work, not even close. So we really had to quickly pull together from what other towns were doing. We looked at South Kingstown at the time. We looked at North Kingstown. I was doing some work in Gloucester that the town looked at. And again, from that, they pulled something together that made sense for Exeter. And you're right, there's a lot to it. You want to make sure that you have standards that are going to work, but then also have some flexibility where appropriate, so you're not precluding perhaps a project that might be actually beneficial. And that's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah. In those initial kind of larger projects that brought this issue more to the forefront, where in Exeter were they? Because I used to live in actually Arcadia management area. So I'm fairly familiar, but I'm just curious where they were.
They were proposed. One of these is still in litigation, but they were proposed. We had a developer come in, wrote their own ordinance that was going to give them more or less exclusive rights to build by right, and everyone else would have to go through a different process. It's a long story that's actually still in litigation from about 3 years ago. Not clear how that's going to turn out. But so far the developer has lost at every step. But that gave us a chance to sort of reboot our ordinance. We didn't have operation and maintenance requirements. We didn't have a decommissioning plan. We didn't have clear solar lot coverage requirements. We really weren't guiding it into any particular area of town. So we were remiss on everything, really. We didn't have applicable setbacks, screening requirements. We didn't require a landscape architect to look at it. Some towns for very large projects, they actually require sort of a short environmental assessment to make sure that there won't be negative impacts. Remember, when you're clearing a large parcel of land, you're making dramatic changes to pre-existing hydrology. Solar developments all over have had big problems with that. Think about a forest. A forest can absorb about 3/4 of an inch of rainfall during the growing season with very little runoff. You remove all the trees, even though that in all the vegetation that's absorbing that rainwater, now you're getting almost all of that rain that was slowly being infiltrated is now running off the site. And that has created erosion and stormwater runoff problems to adjacent property owners. It's encouraged stream channel scouring. It's really been a mess on some sites. And so some towns have, in addition to what DEM requires, with all due respect to DEM, oftentimes they don't have the staff to follow up and do site inspections in a timely manner. So some towns have actually required a third-party neutral person to come in, review, and inspect these developments as they're being built to make sure that they're A, being built in accordance with the plan, B, that all the soil erosion and stormwater management measures were properly installed, and that they're being maintained properly during the course of the construction. DEM doesn't have the staff to do that. So a lot of towns have picked up that responsibility to have the applicant pay for that service. So those are some lessons learned.
That's good. Thanks. So, and just one last piece, getting back to David's question about assistance with drafting. I'm pretty certain I'm not putting Michael and Jennifer on the spot. I think they have good drafting skills in this area. I've had a lot of experience in drafting state legislation, and Michael tells me sometimes I'm too much of a policy wonk with it. But if we had a draft that we felt fairly close to final, is that something you might be able to give us feedback on?
I'd be happy to.
Okay, great.
So Scott, my questions are mostly centered around decommissioning. So to your knowledge, has any other community required both the landowner and the developer, they could be two different people, be responsible for decommissioning and remediation?
Yes, I think a lot of towns do that now. And it's unfortunately, a lot of this is going to fall on the landowner. A lot of solar developers lease the land. They're leasing it under a limited liability corporation. So it's, and a lot of them are selling, they're building these and then selling them to some other entity. In Exeter, we've had problems. One of them's only been online for a couple of years and it's been sold several times. Our tax assessor has a hard time finding out who's the entity that's paying the taxes. National Grid has also had that problem, although National Grid can actually shut down the facility in the event they don't know who owns it. The towns can't. But ultimately, again, it comes down to who owns the land is probably going to be on the hook. So a lot of towns are requiring some kind of a surety be established, and it would have to be done in conjunction with a reputable engineer. If the town has an engineering department or an engineer, or you could use a consultant to peer review what they're proposing. And then now I think we've all become painfully aware of inflation. So whatever surety might be issued this year, in 25 years, that surety is certainly not going to be enough to do the job in the event the landowner or the developer defaults and doesn't clean up the site. So towns have been sort of learning as they go. One town, I think, they revisit it annually, and they have an inflation factor in there. So this year, if inflation's 7%, then more money has to go into this. And it could also be put into an interest-bearing account that the town would manage. So it could, be accruing some value in the event down the road that developer just isn't putting any more money in anymore because they're gone and you can't track them down. So there's a lot to think about. 25 years is a long time. It's just not known what the circumstances are going to be, how expensive it might be. Right now, there are very few facilities that I'm aware of that would recycle the solar panels. So where are they going to go? Who's going to pay to have them, removed and disposed of properly? The town just doesn't want to be on the hook for this. So there's a lot to think about. And again, here's where this delicate balance comes, because on the other hand, solar developers would argue, well, you don't want to be so stringent. That would preclude me from building in a location that you really believe is appropriate. So this is a very challenging ordinance to craft.
How are people determining how much of a surety to require? I mean, that's to your point about not knowing how to dispose of these things. But at this juncture, forget for a moment the inflation issue. I suspect there's probably not good data right now on what you would do with some of these panelists, because they as I understand it, can't be recycled. So it's this question, I suppose, of putting them in a landfill, which is lamentable. But how do you get those kinds of numbers? Is there any learning on that?
There's a lot of stuff out there, but unfortunately, some of it hasn't been peer reviewed. A friend of mine who's interested in this sent me a big file and some of it appears to be from some reputable sources, others is not. So it's hard to get a handle on this. Some towns take they get an independent engineer, someone who they can trust, and they're coming up with about 125% of what that person's estimate might be. And then they're trying to put some kind of an inflation factor in there too. But then again, circumstances could change. If we find out it's very difficult to dispose of these in the future, that number could escalate dramatically. So it's really hard to tell.
Thank you.
Well, I found something on it. I think it was an EPA website, and I at some point I was going to share this with everybody. One thing it said was nobody wants to recycle them. They end up in landfills. Part of the recycling, there are some hazardous materials within these things. It's not just simply glass and aluminum. It said that it probably would be like $25 a panel to dispose of these things. Add to that the cost of just removing them. Add to that the cost, what does it cost to remediate an acre of land? So you could easily get to the point where for an acre of solar panels, we're talking 60, 70, 80,000 bucks minimum just for removal and remediation. So my other question was, is there anything, state statute, the rule of law, that tells us how much we can charge? How big we can make the bond?
Unfortunately, there isn't. And I think that's honestly one of my frustrations with the state is they haven't really exercised a lot of leadership with this. Again, this is a really challenging issue. And if you want to encourage towns to adopt, to invite solar to their town, you need to be giving them this kind of guidance. They could have been hiring consulting firms that would provide formulas that would give you a better understanding of what these risks might be and how to, all these little mundane things are important. Obviously, you need to have a good formula for how do you establish a reasonable surety, because no one wants to be left with inadequate funds at the end of the project's life to be stuck. But that doesn't exist. And as far as I know, they're not working on it, which is unfortunate.
So we could make it, well, the developers would say it would be stiff, but we could make it at such a level where we were comfortable and thought, where we were comfortable with protecting the town from, the future. And
Absolutely.
There's nothing that prevents us from doing that.
No, definitely not.
Very good.
Jay?
Yes.
Mike, I'm sorry. So just so the benefit of the committee, we actually do the two solar, one solar farm that I was involved with as solicitor, we actually did have our consulting engineer look at the engineering or the decommissioning proposal that the applicant had put forward, and we added a couple $100,000 to it. I can't remember. We didn't accept their number. We had our own engineers look at it, and we came to a number. Scott, my question is, one of the things that we heard in Tiverton, especially in the rural towns, as you said, that like the deforestation. So as you know, most cities and towns, if you are a landowner, you have a right to clear your property today, right? If you want to, with very little regulation. If you're a good, maybe DEM, if there's some wetlands on it, maybe you have to get a permit, but very, very, very rarely. So one of the concerns that people have is, so say I own a large piece of land, 20 acres, it's forested. And we have an ordinance that says, well, you can only remove 30% of the trees to put a solar canopy. So maybe if I'm a good investor, or if I'm, have someone backing me, I clear my land today, let it sit fallow for 5 years, and then put solar panels on it. There's really nothing that you can do to prevent that unless you have a look back period. And so it's kind of hard to look back at the intent of the person, if they want to just clear their land. I mean, I could clear a 20-acre parcel today for a housing development if I wanted to, and the town couldn't stop me, subject to DEM regulation. So that's one of the things that I just want to let the committee know, that that's the hardest thing for us to control, is this deforestation.
That's very true. And there have been several cases, one in Exeter, where somebody did clear cut about 20 acres on speculation because a solar developer said that they were interested in their parcel. He was anxious to get started. The solar developer never built the project. The person was left with a 20-acre clear cut. I've talked to him. He's beside himself. He realizes what a stupid thing that he did, because he had an agreement, but he didn't read the fine print, because the fine print gave the solar developer an out in the event the developer couldn't get access to the grid. The cost of upgrading the grid to get access to this person's property was not cost effective. Thereby, the developer wasn't interested in the project anymore. So another thing you need to think about is access to the grid. And developers need three-phase power. They need, so if you live, like I live in a very rural area, I have 45 acres of land, no solar developers are knocking on my door because I don't have three-phase power that runs by my house. It would, even for me to put up a small solar facility to sell electricity back into the grid would be cost prohibitive because they'd have to run the three-phase power almost 2 miles. And that it just wouldn't be worth it. So there's an economy of scale. So if they want to upgrade the grid to build something, then that's when they're looking for these mega projects. They have to be 30, 40 acres and larger, or they're not interested. It's just not cost effective. So in the national grid, and I think the geographic information system now does have some grid capacity information. I know solar developers certainly have a means of getting it, but that's where they're going to want to go because it is very, very expensive. Probably southern Tiverton and more in some of your more rural areas. I don't know for sure, but it's not likely all those areas have three-phase power. So that makes them less attractive unless they're going to build something very large.
Scott, is there any happy news with regard to the deforestation, on a clarity standpoint, on the deforestation or the forestation legislation that's being considered in the legislature? Does that, I know you're not a prognosticator or forecaster what's going to happen, but that would provide us some clarity as to sort of how to move forward if there were to be some likelihood of that legislation passing.
That's a good question. Had a meeting on that today, spoke to one of the state sponsors earlier in the week. There is a bill in the General Assembly, and the bill would essentially make our core forest, or those unfragmented forest areas, 250 acres and larger, ineligible for renewable energy incentives. It would also define preferred locations, and they'd be pretty much developed, disturbed areas, brownfields, landfills, industrial zone, commercial zones, all rooftops. They would make those preferred sites, and it would give the Distributed Energy Board the authority to put disincentives on all parcels that are not preferred sites.
Yes.
I mean, I can never guess what the General Assembly is going to do. It's going to be challenging to get that bill passed. Been working on it, I've been working on solar siting reform for 4 years. But this year I have a bigger coalition than I ever had. One woman sent out an electronic way to sign on and support the bill. And that worked really well. We have over 225 people that have already sent letters in to support this bill. And it hasn't been scheduled for a hearing yet. And the Senate version hasn't been introduced. So we're building up a lot of public support. We're hopeful that we'll get the leadership's attention, but there's no guarantee, unfortunately, a bill like that would pass. But in the event it did, Tiverton does have core forest, those areas of 250 acres or more. You've got some really nice areas of core forest. As a matter of fact, probably might be the only community in the East Bay that does. So from a habitat perspective, from a forest management perspective, it would be critical to maintain that. And it frankly makes no sense for the state to be providing incentives to encourage forest loss when it's been so well documented that Rhode Island needs the forest as well as renewable energy to meet our climate change goals. So we're hoping common sense would prevail. And as more people begin to understand that clearing forest is actually working against meeting our climate change goals, we're hopeful that we can get this important reform.
Scott, are you talking about H7531?
Yes,
So
Who's the
for
sponsor of
those
that?
of you who, excuse
the
me?
House sponsor is
McGraw.
Representative June Speakman. The Senate sponsor is going to be Elena DeMario.
So if anybody wants a copy of this, I can send it to you. And our local representative, Michelle McGaw, is one of the people who introduced it.
I know I've had the pleasure of speaking with her. I know she's a strong supporter and an advocate for this.
She is.
Scott, am I correct that it would be useful to us to try to think, and on the off chance this is going, first off, there's been a lot of work go into it. And secondly, it might provide us some language, then some shaping of the ordinance to comport with whatever is passed. Of course, it would override whatever we did if we were inconsistent with it. But am I correct that you think it would be wise to take that language into account as we do the drafting?
Especially the way they're defining the preferred siting locations. I think that would be wise. And again, those are subject to change, but I'd be happy to send you a revised copy of that. It's pending. I actually worked on some revisions today to address some concerns that we've heard from the leadership.
That'd be great.
Meantime, I can send them tomorrow what is in the mill right now.
Right, and that will change a little bit, but
The
not.
point of departure anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, please do.
Trish,
Scott, the basics of that bill are so logical that it's hard to understand why, even if the bill doesn't pass, adopting an ordinance that's very similar or follows the essential principles of that bill doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense, especially in Tiverton. We do actually, believe it or not, have three-phase power running down both the main arteries that run north and south in Tiverton, all the way to the southern part of Tiverton. So some of those big forested acres and those great farms actually do have almost immediate access to three-phase power, which is a little unfortunate. And we also have the additional, as you mentioned, the hydrology, we have the additional complication that, the vast majority of our town and all of the southern part of the town relies entirely on, private wells for their well water. We don't have an aquifer. We've just got fractured bedrock and septic systems and essentially soil that's poor for septic systems. So the preservation of our groundwater is really critical if we're going to, have enough potable, safe drinking water for everybody who needs it. Has anybody yet started or has crafted an ordinance that's kind of in that vein where they've been fairly restrictive on residential areas with carve-outs for maybe agriculture or the brownfields or former landfills, the contaminated sites, and done a good job of trying to incentivize people and maybe being a little more generous with setbacks or lot coverage in industrial areas or commercial areas? Has anybody sort of
Exeter has done some of that, where we relax our solar lot coverage in the areas where you want to encourage it. That's probably the biggest incentive that you can provide, because that's by reducing the solar land coverage requirement, you're sort of squeezing the footprint, if you will, of how big that solar development can be. So remember, there's an economy of scale. The solar developer is going to want to make it as big as they reasonably can build on the site. So by relaxing that standard in areas where you want it, that's a good way to drive it to those areas. You could have it more stringent in residentially zoned areas, to the point where you might just be allowing somebody to have, like, a lot of people don't want solar on the roof for a lot of different reasons. So they're building small ground mounted facilities essentially in their lawn. They're about the same size of the solar panels that you would see on a roof. And if they're in somebody's backyard, it's not typically controversial. Sometimes you don't even see it. So you don't want to preclude something like that, but you don't want somebody to clear cut a large forested area. Other towns have made it clear. Tiverton has done this. Little Compton has done this, where they have limits on the forest clearing. No more than X% of the site can be cleared. That makes it pretty clear. That's giving a clear direction to the solar developer that they have to do something very small scale if they're going to be building in that area. Another option that no town has done yet is you could require for every acre that might be disturbed for a solar development, you're requiring an additional acre be preserved either elsewhere in town or on that same site in perpetuity. And don't accept the solar development itself, because you don't want this open space to be an antiquated solar facility that you're on the hook to clean up. Some developers have offered that, and towns have said, no thanks.
So what you're saying is then I, as a developer, wanting to put a development X, you let me do that as long as I buy some land Y and donate it to open space?
Yes. You could play with the ratio. You can make it 1-to-1, or maybe it's a large parcel and a landowner says, look, I've got this back area where I can put some solar. And you might say, okay, it can be screened. Perhaps no one's going to see it. And you might decide maybe that works, but you'd want an equal amount of land preserved in perpetuity that could benefit the town. But it would have to be meaningful land, not wetland, land that could be beneficial to the town of Tiverton in some way.
But could I just ask a question? I didn't want to let it pass. And I'm not suggesting this is my view because I don't have one, but why wouldn't we at least consider saying you can't build in a residential area any ground solar in your home? You're going to have to cut down trees to do that. It's going to result in some degree of deforestation. Use your roof. And you said people don't want to put it on their roof. I mean, I'm curious, is that a cost issue? Is it a safety issue? I mean, what are we going to face if we were to consider no ground mounted solar for personal use in your backyard? Let's just assume we were going to consider that. What do we run into with that kind of approach?
I think you're going to get a lot of pushback, and I think it would be legitimate because some people don't have a roof that has good southern access. It could be shaded by a beautiful tree that they don't want to cut down. And they might have a place on their property that could be screened from adjacent properties, public roads that could work.
Okay.
And again, it wouldn't be, and some people, they have better technology now. They have some of these ground mounts are on a single pole and they can actually track the sun. Even during the day or by the season. As the sun gets higher in the sky this time of year, it can tilt to actually take more advantage of that. So you probably don't want to preclude that. For the most part, they have not been controversial. And I'm not aware of any town that has banned that yet.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and David, I would say that if I wanted to do that, because of the trees that have come down in storms, and I have a perfect southern exposure. I'm up in North Tiverton. I could easily do that. I don't want to do it, but I could easily probably do that with little need for any other clearing, if any. I will say, though, that my sense of one of our council members who is as much, maybe even more worried about home-based solar, she, I think, has already said she doesn't really want those types of arrays. So that would still be something, that might be challenging to get through the council. I don't, so just something to consider.
So may I ask a question about that? And I'm curious about this because, we did have, Scott, the 3 solar farms that have gone in here, right, which have all been on big pieces of prime farmland before we repealed the ordinance. The hue and outcry from the citizenry here was pretty loud. And in thinking about that sort of ground mounted thing, Tiverton has portions that are fairly rural where the houses are spread far apart, where you don't see into your neighbor's backyard, and probably doing something like that might not be so difficult. In the northern part of town, though, we've got, a lot of whole sections of essentially 15,000 foot square lots where, everybody sort of shares a backyard. So we have a large portion of town where, the houses are very close together. And, if you put a solar panel in your backyard, your neighbors are going to see it. Potentially it blocks the sun into your neighbor's, kitchen window. Are there, is there a thought about whether or not, if you were to allow something like that, and I'll be honest, I don't really know whether or not folks in Tiverton would really want that or if they wouldn't. But is there a thought around how much screening you need to have, or whether or not, putting your solar panel, where you've got all these small lots and now you're blocking the sunlight to your, to your neighbor's kitchen, does that start to become problematic? I mean, do you have to have a certain amount of space to be able to do that?
I mean, you certainly could, and that's where the solar, coverage limits come into play, and the lot coverage for the house already. If somebody has a very small lot, they already have a home on it, they might have a detached garage, maybe some other outbuilding, they might be getting close to their lot coverage requirements. So if you consider this part of that lot coverage, that begins to narrow down how much they could do. And then if you had standards about setbacks from adjacent properties and it had to be screened, it would narrow it down even further. There's different schools of thought on zoning. Some people like performance type of zoning. In other words, they establish performance criteria, and then if you can meet those criteria, you can have that particular use. That's one way to go at this. And that way, if you can comply with all the standards that you've set and somebody can demonstrate that to your zoning inspector or whoever is going to be reviewing this, then it would be an allowed use. If they can't, then obviously it's not allowed. But I haven't seen a lot on those little small facilities. I'll have to look further at that. The best of my knowledge, they haven't been that big of a problem yet. And the reason being is that they're a lot more expensive than putting it on your roof. So there's an economic incentive for landowners, if they possibly can, they want to get it on the roof because it's substantially cheaper.
My tax lady has 2 of those tracking units in her backyard.
I have one last question, if that's okay. The genesis of our original solar ordinance was actually a farmer, a legitimate, sizable farmer in Tiverton who'd been approached and had an interest in adding solar as an adjunct. And of course, we're very protective of our farms here. We have a fair amount of farmland left, and we want to preserve it. And we want to try and help our farmers continue to farm. So we created this ordinance, which turned out to be a disaster. And as it turned out, that one farmer never went forward with the solar option. But if we were to come up with something and within the agricultural community, we wanted to try and do a carve out for the legitimate farms, the true legitimate farms. to try and help them be able to, continue to farm their land. Has anybody done a pretty good job of that? So it doesn't become a situation where, you've got a large working farm, and 3/4 of it gets turned over to solar, and now you've, got a small working farm with a big solar installation. Has anybody come up with a fairly good model for that yet?
I haven't seen it in Rhode Island, but Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts in particular, has been working on the co-location of solar on agriculture for over 10 years. And they've been advocating that you actually allow solar canopies on farms. So you can actually farm between the canopies. Those canopies are more expensive, but in Massachusetts, they actually are providing incentives to solar developers to help farmers do that. And I know there's a lot that UMass has done with that, but Massachusetts criteria are pretty stringent. They want to see that the production, whatever the farm was doing with respect to production before solar, remains equal to or greater afterwards. So in other words, they don't want to see somebody's primary purpose for doing this is just for solar. They want to maintain the agricultural use of the property. And I thought that was a good way of doing it. And that gets a little tricky. How do you know you're maintaining the same, production, because crops can change, and that gets challenging. I'm not sure how Massachusetts does that, but obviously they've worked out some criteria.
Well, we could, in the case of a farm, limit the size of a solar array to maybe, let's just say for argument, 125% of their actual need. And that would allow them to expand their business, but they wouldn't be able to put in a big solar array and make that their principal source of income. Similar to what you can do with a roof. In Rhode Island, net metering the like, they look at your past 3 years of average use, and that's the most you can put on the roof and get paid for it. So
A lot of farmers are looking for smaller scale solar farms, and there's been quite a few of them built in South County. Their footprint probably ranges about an acre to maybe an acre and a half. They're not real big. And they try to tuck them at a portion of the farm that's the least productive from an agricultural standpoint. And the argument being by the farmer, it's a good way to supplement their income, because the farming is hard. They're just not generating the revenue that they'd like to keep the farm going. So a lot of towns have been sensitive to that, because they don't want to see the farmer sell out to housing development, because then the entire farm could be lost. So again, it's one of those balancing acts. But there is a farm in South County who is proposing to develop probably 90% of the farm, and that's become very controversial. And the town is not in favor of that. So that one is probably going to be debated for some time. I would hate to see something like that. So if you allow it, you have to be careful that it doesn't become too much, too large. So you might have to set some kind of reasonable footprint. It can't exceed a certain footprint. And you might have siting criteria that you're not putting it into the most, if it has prime agricultural soils, you may not want it located there. But if he has a more rocky pasture or something that's not as productive, that would be the logical location to put it.
So support, not supplant.
Right.
And as a rule, are solar panels ground mounted considered to be pervious or impervious?
DEM has said that because that the land underneath is pervious, they've determined that they're pervious. However, they're they're revisiting that because of the land clearing has created tremendous problems with increased runoff. Very severe.
Scott, I'm going to make an assumption. When we were talking earlier about disposal and recycling, and you talked about, and we've really focused a lot on the larger arrays. I'm assuming that the same challenges arise with rooftop and canopy and ground mounted, these smaller ones, that is, within any solar really does not have a good recycling capacity. Is that true? Yeah.
That's essentially true.
Yeah. Okay.
The upside is there's less to deal with. It's a smaller footprint.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, a question. In the scale of systems that developers are looking at these days, what sorts of things are they chasing? Are they chasing small, medium, large, or utility size?
Most of them want utility size. That's where, because the cost of connecting to the grid is so expensive. One solar developer who I've worked with told me a 5 megawatt facility that might be in the neighborhood of 20 acres was going to cost $5 million to hook up to the grid. And that was the number he was given by National Grid, $5 million. So it's very expensive. And that's a whole nother problem that the state needs to start looking at. My concern is right now, National Grid might be allowing somebody to upgrade the grid in the western part of the state someplace where we don't have a large population center, and we're not likely to ever have a large population center. Instead, we should be focusing on upgrading the grid where density already exists. Because as Rhode Island makes the transition to renewable energy, more and more people are going to be driving electric vehicles. Some people might start heating their home with electricity. They might be using more electric appliances like lawnmowers, etc. The demand for electricity is going to increase. Rhode Island has what they call the urban service boundary. That's where the state provide, communities are served by public water, public sewer for the most part. You can sort of imagine where that is in Rhode Island. It's sort of like the Providence metro area. That area is going to have huge demand for electricity that right now, if half the population probably bought an EV, they wouldn't be able to charge the vehicle. There wouldn't be enough electricity. So we have to start upgrading the grid strategically to make sure that as we make this transition to use more EVs and more electricity, we can actually get the electricity to people who want to use it. So that's why I'm not a big fan of extending the grid out into the hinterlands of Rhode Island, because that in the long range, that's not helping us.
So the reality is that we almost need to worry a great deal about the utility sized deal. And my understanding from the Amoresco installation was that we had a difficult, if not impossible, time finding out, what's the grid capacity in South Tiverton? Could they connect up to it? And, all sorts of things like that. Because I remember that as being a real dark mystery to us when we were looking at it.
It is a mystery, and I think some solar developers want it to remain that way. It's almost like they all have their own proprietary way of dealing with it. They don't like to share that kind of information with competitors. It's this weird game that they play, but other states have done a really good job. My favorite is Vermont. Vermont has said, okay, we're going to identify on a regional basis, and they have county government in Vermont, which makes it a lot easier. But they worked with counties and they said, these are the areas where we're not going to provide solar incentives. And they had certain core forests and certain important habitat, and farming and tourism is really big in Vermont. They didn't want to see solar fields in the middle of beautiful scenic highways. So they made it really clear that certain areas were going to be sort of off limits. But then they wanted each county to come up with areas where it would be acceptable. And then they tried to match that up with grid capacity, or where the grid could be reasonably upgraded. And it's really worked well. Vermont is just moving along nicely. Solar developers love it because they like certainty. So if they know that they're going to be building in a certain location, it's like the zoning is already in place. They're not going to get a lot of pushback, and the grid either has the capacity or it's programmed to be increased in that location. It just makes their job so much easier. And here it's just become so adversarial that the process is just really broken.
Anybody else? Okay, well, Scott, we really appreciate your time and your help. And you can bet you're going to be hearing from us again.
I'd be happy to help. And I think you're going about this the right way, by thinking very carefully about where you'd like it, where you don't want it. You're asking the right questions. You're certainly raising the right issues. And it's important to get this right. It's just unfortunate that there hasn't been better guidance and a better program, frankly, coming from the state.
I agree with that. Okay, so
Thank you, Scott.
thanks very much, Scott.
One last question, Scott.
Sure.
If we as individuals or the town wanted to support the legislation, obviously if the council chooses to, they could do a resolution, but if individuals wanted to do that, is there a link to the site that you were mentioning, or?
I'd be happy to send it. I could send it. I think I've got Jay's email. I could send it to Jay. Someone has taken the initiative to put this out. It makes it very easy. You can click on a link, see the bill. There's a short description of what the bill would do. And then you could just click on another link, and there's a form letter, if you wish, that you can customize to meet your needs, and then send it right to the appropriate person in the state. So your testimony goes on record. And that would be very helpful. Honestly, the more people who do that, the better.
Okay, as soon as I get it, I will pass it on.
Okay, thank you so much. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that. It was a pleasure meeting with you. Keep up the good work.
It was very
Pleasure
helpful.
has been ours.
Yeah, thanks.
Have a good night.
You too.
You too. All right, so for general business, I will, where you at? We have Bill Vierra, who is a member of the town council and has thrown his hat in the ring to become a member of this board. And as part of that, Mike Burk has requested that Bill Vierra replaces him, and that he in turn will become an ex officio member, which means he can partake, but he can't vote.
So you won't get rid of me.
I want to get rid of you. I don't need you.
But I think, I'll, Bill, certainly I don't want to step on you. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, that's it.
Evening,
Bill was
everyone.
gonna say
Nice to meet you. I tried to spare you, Mike Burke. I didn't do that, but I think between the both of us, hopefully we have a lot to offer. So it's nice meeting you, and I look forward to seeing you in person.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, and part of the reason we did that is, Bill had an interest in this as well, and and we didn't want to crowd it with voting members of the council. And as an ex officio non-voting, I don't count towards quorum. So if I can't make it some night, and not enough others make it, it doesn't get in the way of doing business.
Very good. Okay, and so everybody should have, and I hope I managed to get this to everybody, copies of the old rescinded ordinance, the draft ordinance, Scott Millar's comments on the draft ordinance. So if anybody did not get, does not have all those, let me know. I'll make sure you get them. For general interest, there's a lot of discussion about the comprehensive plan, and keeping in mind, we're not going to change it. But just so you, in case you're interested, and if you have a copy of it, on page 58, Design Standards Action 15, solar panels are mentioned once, and that's for the entire document. So we get no support from the comprehensive plan other than what it says about, in its entirety, and that's how you have to look at it, about quality of life, quality of land, all those kinds of things. I would invite everybody at their leisure to look at other communities' solar ordinances. They're easy, well, they're not necessarily easy to find, but they're all available on each town's website. Mike, when you were talking about trade groups, there's one big trade group that I came across, and I have to find out where it is. You were talking more national, weren't you?
Necessarily, there are trade groups within Rhode Island for various things. I don't know if there's a trade group related to solar in Rhode Island.
I didn't find one. I found a big one though.
And again, I don't think we have to beat ourselves up trying to find somebody. If there was somebody evident out there to come give their perspective, at the same time, it might be something that we want to hold off on until we get to a point where we have at least a reasonable draft to get input from a variety of viewpoints. Again, just so that folks don't think that we're excluding them intentionally to not have, that kind of input. It doesn't mean we have to accept their input. And I'm really worried about the disposal piece myself.
Oh my.
One of the key aspects that I'm worried about.
Yeah.
I did send you a link, Jay, that if you want to share of the UMass Amherst agriculture and solar webpage that Scott had mentioned tonight.
You send it to me or everybody?
To you.
You send it to everybody?
No, I sent it just to you.
Oh, okay.
Just a few minutes ago. Just a few minutes
I
ago.
will. Well, when I get done with this,
That's fine.
I can't multitask on this thing.
Yeah, that's fine.
So can anybody think of any other resources that would be useful that they've stumbled across or know about?
I think there's a pretty good list of them, but I think, maybe we should, maybe it would be good to send out one email to everybody, and I would help you put this together with the list of all the resources and links, right, to the documents, so that everybody had an email that had all the resources and the links. And then, as we go through the process, if we come across something or a resource that we want more information from, maybe we contact them and ask them if they're available to answer some questions or come talk to us, or maybe the data or the information is already there and it's clear and easy to understand and interpret.
This list of links could effectively act as a virtual library rather than having,
Good.
sending us all the documents. I mean, most of us should be able to get those.
Keep in mind, this is a very large subject, and it's easy to become overwhelmed by all of it, really. I mean, because it includes forestry, it includes water, it includes land use, it just includes so many things that have to come together. And I could send you everything I have, but you would be inundated.
So,
Uh,
just a thought, Jay, on what Jim had just said about the virtual library, and I don't think we have a place on the town website. But we might want to talk to Dave Robert about, just like we did with the short-term rentals, although it's not as active as what I had been hoping, to put a piece on the town website for the solar advisory to keep it transparent. And that might be where we put that virtual library page, so that anybody can access it. They can look at the same materials that we're looking at.
Well, I'll talk to Dave Robert directly about that, because I was asked by somebody why our meetings weren't posted on the town website, and I inquired if we could get a spot. And I was told there was no interest in doing that. So I will have a conversation with Dave Robert to see if we can do it through the back door.
Okay.
I can see how you're looking, Mike, but that's the response I got.
Mike looks perplexed.
Yeah, he does. I had the same feeling.
Jim, if you know, we don't know each other well, but in all my time in government, one of my mantras is be as transparent as we can. Sometimes we stumble, but I'm a firm believer in transparency. And
Yeah.
if there's a tool to help with that, then we try to use that tool to the best of our ability.
Well, I'll see if I can work this out. I'll talk to Dave tomorrow. All right, now, one other big thing we got to do is figure out the schedule for April. So let me get my cheat sheet here. So I guess the best way to go about this is we'll start. I already know Trish's. Mike, other than town council meetings, or Bill rather, town council meetings and harbor commission meetings, are there any dates in the month of April that you cannot attend a meeting?
No,
Wow. Renee, same question. Other than EDC, you're muted.
EDC is on April 14th.
Yep. Other than that, you're good?
And well, actually, I'm actually out of town from the 7th through the 11th.
So 7, 8, 9th. So
10th.
7, 8, and 11, we'll say, because the others are
Yeah.
weekends.
Right.
Hang on. No. Bill, okay. Amanda, same question?
So I'm on the juvenile hearing board and the planning board as well.
Yeah.
And
Juvenile doesn't meet that often, though, right?
although, I'm sorry.
Juvenile doesn't meet very often.
It depends. We're meeting this April 6th, I believe.
We're at,
We meet at the senior center down the street.
okay. So Renee can't do the 6th,
Yep. And then
or Amanda, rather.
Amanda, yeah. And then I am
Sorry.
out of town from the 20th to the 26th.
26th?
Yeah. I need a break.
Okay, that's fine. Everybody's got to take a vacation. And, well, Mike Marcello and Jennifer will be probably joining us by phone, correct?
Yes, probably. So the 5th is the planning board meeting, just to.
Yeah, and one of the things I didn't say is I've already penciled in all these other boards and commissions, particularly the ones that hold at the town hall. I'm just trying to figure these other dates out. When it's all said and done, I'll have figured out a schedule. Mike Burk, so we're the council and you're the EDC.
Yeah, and again, you don't have to count me towards one. I think the only evening meeting I have for work is.
Oh, yeah.
And it's likely in person.
Is it the first Monday or something?
Well, that, but now I have two statewide task force that I'm on. So the 20th is likely when I'll be out, but I think Amanda, you said you might be out that time too, anyway. Yeah.
So you can't do the 20th for sure.
Yeah, and then Mondays before our council meetings, I often have a meeting.
Oh, so that'll be like the 11th and the 25th.
Right, and I think,
But it doesn't, you have those anyway for the council.
right, and I think we said the 11th might be, I don't remember if we did for the Charter Commission before the council meeting, unless I have.
Well, I wouldn't schedule any of them for a council meeting date anyway, because we now, after the 31st of March, have to be live in person at the town hall, which is where I prefer to be. Okay, Jim?
As far as I know, the 11th, which is also a council night, would be, so it's moot. I have no known interference.
And I already had talked to Tricia. Who am I missing?
David,
Dave Carden.
who.
Where'd
had to
David
leave.
go?
He had to
Oh, he
leave.
had to leave. I'll call him. Oh, Chris is okay. David's, I don't know. All right, well, so. Okay, so I think we had previously said that our first task should be to nail down yay or nay on ground mounted and where, right?
And like ground mounted should be a nay in, the small lots
Well,
of
no, I
far
mean,
North
for-
Tiverton.
What I mean to say is for purposes of writing up an agenda, was that, did we decide that the first thing we wanted to discuss and
Michael, how specific do you think we need to get on the agendas?
I think you should, at this point, just keep it general review of other ordinances, proposals, I'll help you draft to keep it. I don't think you have to get that specific at this point.
so just a vanilla agenda?
Somewhat, yeah. And then
Okay.
when we start voting on actual definitions and stuff, we probably have to get more specific, but
Okay,
you need to be flexible enough to get some stuff. I mean, I think one of the most important things you have to do is actually get the zoning map, and you need to figure out, banning solar farms in residential zones sounds good. And it's not my call to make, but as most of you know, most of your farmland is in residential zones.
it is.
So if you ban solar ordinances in residential zones, you just ban it from farmland. So I think you have to be a little bit more strategic than that. If you want to preserve farms, then you got to figure out. Not sure.
We'll have to carve
we have
that
a public
out.
member with
You
us.
might have a carve out, right?
Yeah,
Have to carve
I'm
that
sorry,
out.
but the solicitor has competition right now because.
I know. I thought everyone was smiling at me, but then I realized it wasn't me.
Yeah.
Right, we have a,
Oh,
We all
I
stopped.
wasn't
paying
even looking
attention
down. Well, here we go. We got
to me.
problems.
a new ex officio member.
It's super cute. It's
I know I
beautiful.
wasn't that cute, so.
Well, how come it keeps on getting blurred? Is that something built into the?
He moves back. 'Cause
So
it has a
I-
background. See?
If Mike, would it be okay if we sort of came up with some sort of general broad statement about, discussion and possible vote on, on zones, on, like just.
Yeah, that's
make
fine.
it-
Yeah, I would say possible discussion and preliminary vote. I mean, nothing's gonna be binding until you get the whole,
Right.
until you get the whole ordinance together, because everything's gonna, if you change it here, you're gonna have to change it there, just so you know, so just from a legal perspective, zoning ordinances begins with definitions, and then they begin with a use table, a use table is where they're gonna be allowed, and then within that use table, or depending where they are, then we talk about setbacks and coverage and lot coverage. And so that's just kind of like I would just try to follow the same pattern as a normal zoning ordinance, but specific to solar.
I would, although I think I think a little bit our task, at least at a high level, maybe to get started, is to sort of take things in kind of big blocks and general theory kind of idea and see if we can coalesce around a consensus and then move into more specific things.
Makes sense, yeah. I mean, I'm very interested in this legislation to see what that definitions they have there. That's probably a good place to start, so.
Yeah.
And-
And I would also encourage people, to look at some of the other ordinances that are out there. Some of them are really well written and they're not terribly long. They're fairly short to the point. It's concise. So if anybody has time to look at something else and they find something interesting, they should feel free to, bring it to the meeting and bring it to everybody's attention. Same with the definitions. I mean, there are some really good ones out there. We can just steal
Yeah.
somebody else's.
They've already been pretty well defined. So just so everybody knows, we got about 10 weeks before this has to be turned over to the town council. I would assume that the last 2 weeks will be involved in the solicitor and Jennifer smoothing the thing out, us reviewing it. So that leaves like 8 weeks to do the meat of the task. Does anybody have any problem with meeting once a week?
No.
Okay,
I'll do my best. And I think, Jay, as long as we're making progress, I don't see the council as
Thank you.
saying, okay, well, you didn't meet your 10 weeks, so you're not doing your job. The rest of the council, anyway. I think it's really about making progress and not just having a committee that's sitting there not doing it and we can't come to conclusion on it.
right.
Want to be
I
spinning our
agree.
wheels.
Yeah, I agree, as long as we're making progress. If it turns out that I have to go before them yet, again, and ask for an extension, I don't think it would be a problem, but we should work toward the goal we currently have. And who knows, we may surprise ourselves and finish within that time frame.
Bill, I'm sorry.
Bill, here?
Now, I missed the first meeting, obviously. Are we using as a guidance the original was proposed? Or are we starting right from scratch?
I'll put it to you this way. The consensus was that we start with a blank sheet. However, I did send everybody the previous ordinance that was rescinded and the previous draft, more to give everybody an idea of what it should look like. Not necessarily we have to follow every line of it. That's pretty much what we decided to do.
Jay, I for one would, and I'm fairly familiar, but I'm wondering if others would feel it helpful just to kind of take a little bit at the beginning of the next meeting to review the zoning maps, to really get a sense of where's R60, where's R80, and you can look online. I am looking right now while we're talking, but it's, just might be helpful.
I talked to Joan about that, and we will be meeting in the town hall, and when I give her dates, I'll make sure she sticks that map outside the door so we'll have it in front of us. There's one hanging inside the clerk's office.
Right.
Nice big colored thing, so that'll help. All right. So I will let everybody know what I come up with for agenda dates. We will have a meeting a week. We should have no problem having at least 4 of the voting members at the same meeting at the same time. So, anybody have anything else? Does anybody want to volunteer to be the secretary, even though it's not on the agenda? We'll talk about it next meeting then.
Yeah.
All right, so do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
We have a second, so. All right, all those in favor, I guess we got to do this by voice. Can we raise our hand, Mike?
Good.
Can't hear you, Michael.
Breaking the rules for the last day, so just raise your hand so everyone can see it. It's quicker than-
Thank you. Okay, the aye. Mike, Burke, raise your
can't.
hand.
I can't.
Why?
I'm
Not
ex
voting.
officio. I'm not voting.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.